So I'm here today to talk to you about jobs in games. I will give you like a quick one-stop different jobs and categories that there are, and we also look at the industry and how a game is made. There will be some interactive bits, which I'll introduce you to later, so just be mentally prepared. It's nothing scary, no one has to come out here and talk, but I will ask you to participate, so also you don't fall asleep in your seats listening to me ramble. I speak fast. If I speak too fast, feel free to kind of just raise your hand and tell me to slow down or repeat something, and I'll explain why I speak fast in a second. So Julie just gave me like a much nicer introduction than I would have done for myself, so I'll go through this a bit quicker. I worked in the video games industry for 10 years. I started out in translation and testing of video games, and I actually translated games from English to German. The game I worked on mostly was RuneScape for Jagex. I was at that company for 7.5, close to 8 years. So I put a lot of bad puns into games and got paid for it, which was fantastic. Afterwards, I worked for Intergames, working more on careers. And how I got there, I thought I might also share with you, because it's always interesting to see how people got into the industry. So because I grew up in Germany, I can't really tell you exactly what kind of school I went to, but it is comparative to 3 A levels. Afterwards, I studied computer science and media, where we did a bit of programming and tech stuff, and also a little bit of everything to do with games and programming. Right now, there's much more advanced and better programs that actually have to do with games, so that's a cool change since the many years ago that I actually studied. Also, personally, I have 2 cute cats, and I also have ADHD. If you've never heard this, it stands for Attention Deficit and Hyperactivity Disorder, which sounds scary, but isn't. It just means my brain is wired slightly different than that of others. And also, I'm in good company in the video games industry, because actually for people with ADHD and autism, there's a really high number of representation there. We have about 18 to 20% of the games industry are what we call neurodivergent. So if you have ADHD yourself or autism, this is a very welcoming field to go into, and I just thought I mentioned that. And also, aside from all the professional stuff, I love video games. That's why I wanted to work in games. I really like to play. At the moment, Baldur's Gate. But I also love board games, I like languages, I like building stuff, I like tea, importantly, and the outdoors. So that's me. We have a relatively full room, which is exciting, so I'm not going to be able to get through all of you, but I'd like to get a sense of you. So can you just raise your hand if you've ever played any digital game and had fun doing it? Computer, mobile, console? Well, that's a good start. And if you hadn't, I would recommend you go upstairs and check it. Next step, have you thought about working in games before? Okay, that's still a lot of you. And of those of you who have thought about it before, do you already have a clear idea of what you want to do in games? What your job? Okay. So for those who haven't yet raised their hands, I hope I can give you some ideas of what jobs are out there and what you can do. But start with the games industry, because before we want to see if we should do a job, we should check, are there any jobs there and where would I work? So in the UK, there's more than 2,200 active games companies, which is a lot. Some of them are just one person big, because you can have a company on your own, and some of them have several hundred employees. There's also 200 game service providers, which is something also always worth mentioning. You don't have to work in a game studio. Some organizations also work and they just make artful games. So if someone's making a game and they suddenly need a lot of artists, they might just work with a service provider. And also, when it comes to the different types of roles that there are in games, at one of the recent surveys, they found there's 150 different jobs, just different types of jobs alone for the games industry, which is a lot and definitely too much for this hour, but I picked some of them out for you to give you some idea what you could be doing in games. And let's think big picture first. What do you need to make a game? Who do you need? What if you think of the last game you played and you imagine the screen and all that's going on in there, what kind of jobs or tasks are there to be done to make a game? Anyone wanna? Yes?
Web designer?
Okay, yeah, web designer. We might wanna put the game on the website. Yep.
Game designers.
Game designers, yep. Okay. Anything else? Yes, awesome. That's very advanced, yeah. QA testers, exactly. And we also need programmers to make things move. Overall, there's like several big categories we can split this into. We have art, that's all the graphic stuff. We have audio, because if you played a game and there's no sound, it would suddenly feel very boring. We have production, people working in the background to make sure everything stays on track. Design are the people that make up the rules of the game. And don't worry, I'll go into these into much more depth in a minute, so you don't have to keep up. There's programming, QA and testing, services and operations, because most games businesses are really big businesses. And like any business, you need people who make the whole thing run and tick. You can't just have creative people running around and doing stuff. You also need someone to make sure there's lawyers and finances and everything is in order. And marketing. If no one knows about your game, no one's going to play it. So, and I want to get into some of these specific jobs in a bit more detail. So let's see that in practice. I'll take you through a little tour of how games are made. So we're also going to talk about the different stages a game goes through. It's going to be simplified. So some of these games might go about this a bit differently. So don't take this as like holy scripture, but in general, this is roughly the stages games go through. We start with planning and pre-production. And the first step, we need to create the foundations of our game. And we're going to do this together now. This is where the interactive part comes in. So I'm going to get you to vote. And because I'm really bad at counting fast, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but I'm going to ask you to hum. And I'll show you what this looks like in a second. So if I suggest an option and you think like, yeah, it's okay, you can just go, If you like the idea, you can go, And if you really like the idea, you go, like up the volume and the enthusiasm. So can we practice this? You're unenthusiastic, please. 3, 2, 1. Okay, you're slightly more enthusiastic, And a happy, excited, I want to make this game. Okay, you've got this. Usually I've got to repeat this, so thank you for the energy. Okay, so let's make a game together and let's figure out what our game is about. So I'm going to give you 3 options. Puzzle game, which means it's we might give them some logical things to solve, the players. They might have to combine things to figure things out. A rhythm game, where it's more about music and making things work to the beat of the game. Or an adventure game, where it's more about the story and us kind of going through more maybe a elaborate world to figure it out. So let's vote who wants to make a puzzle game. Okay. How about the rhythm game? Adventure game? Okay, glad. I'm glad something got you excited otherwise. Okay, so we are making an adventure game. Great start, team. We've now set some of the foundations. Next, the nice thing about games is they can be anywhere, right? So I'm going to give you 3 options again. Do we want an underwater setting? Is it going to be set in a fairy tale? Or is it going to be set in the future? And specifically in Norwich in 400 years. And 24. It's hard to say. Okay, let's vote again. Underwater. Okay. Fairy tale. Okay. Norwich in the future. Okay, that's between underwater, only underwater votes. Norwich in the future. Okay, so we have an adventure game in Norwich in the future. And what is our player after in Norwich in the future as we take them through the world of the game? What are they trying to find? I'll give you the options: frogs, love, or knowledge. So do we want to find some frogs? Okay. How about love? Knowledge? Okay, I'm very enthusiastic about the future of Norwich, where frogs suddenly become a really important currency of some sorts. So that's cool. We already have a very interesting IP, because I don't think I've ever played a game about Norwich in the future where you look for frogs. Amazing. So you are all already amazing potential game designers. What a game designer does is they make up the rules of the game. They say what's going to happen in the game, why it's going to happen, how it's going to happen. They work a lot closely with all the other departments to make that thing a reality. For that, you need skills. Like, you need to be a really good communicator. You need to be able to tell everyone what to do and how to do it. You need to be creative, like you all are with your frogs, and you need to be good at problem solving, because once you get to the stage, you might get like, oh, so what are the frogs actually good for? What do they do? What can the player do with them? You might also have to notice, at some point you might notice, well, the frogs can hop and now they're all hopped away, so that's an issue. So you have to also think on your feet and figure out how you solve problems. And again, you design the rules of the world, you balance mechanics, and you work a lot with other people. So that's one of the possible jobs. The next job that often comes in at the stage is the narrative designer. You can think as the narrative designer as related to the game designer, but their focus is a bit more on the story. They might come up with the really specific research on like, why are frogs suddenly so important? They make the story, they make it engaging for us, especially if you have an adventure. We might want a really compelling story as a player, so we stay involved in this. So you have to be a good writer. If you love writing stories, if you love making stuff up, that could be a future job. You also have to be good at documentation, because making up stories is one thing. You also have to be good at writing them down so that everyone later can make sense of it. And the nice thing is, narrative is also often told through the environment and not just through words. So you can also have to be quite good at imagining things. So what you do is you develop the story of the world, the history, what led to the frog invasion of Norwich. You might develop the dialogues. What do players say to each other when they start talking? And if you react angry to a player or happy to a player, what then? How are they reacting to you, and how does that change the story? So again, if you love making stories, that's a cool job for you. Producers, personally, some of my favorite people, because producers really hold the team together. If you have skills, if you're really good at, again, communicating is almost all of these, but if you're really good at planning, if you're usually the one that gets all your friends to do stuff together and make sure that you all show up to the same thing, if you're really good at keeping on track with stuff in school and making sure projects are delivered on time and actually can help a group do this, you might be a great future producer. The producers manage timelines and budgets, they coordinate teams and resources, and they make sure that the team is developed on time, which is very important, because if you put a lot of creative people in a room together, they might spend ages there, but they will never get out until someone goes like, come on, when's your game? You said we will have frogs by the end of the month. So really important role. Concept artist. We need someone to draw. What do characters look like in the year 2424? What do the frogs look like? And the concept artist usually does the drawings in 2D. So if you're really good at drawing and art, this might be a cool job for you. And again, if you're creative, if you like art, this might be a cool job. What you do as a job is you create a visual documentation. So you will show people, this is what everything has looked like. Is this going to be like a comic-y style game? Is it going to look really sinister and futuristic? You get a lot of feedback from the art directors and then put that feedback into the design. And you might also make mood boards. Mood boards are really fun to make. So for example, as you do the initial stages, you might just collect a lot of pictures that you think, I think this is how this game could actually look and feel like. So concept artist, if you're creative, cool job. Right, now we have the idea for our game. And we have a few people that made some really cool plans, determined some timelines, determined the look and feel of it. Now we're moving into the next stage, and that stage is production. In production, we actually make the game. Even though we already put in a lot of work, we now have to actually make that happen. So now we need a few more professionals to do this. The programmer, very important, because right now we just have pictures of frogs. They don't do anything yet. We need someone to speak to the computer and tell them, if you press this button, this will happen. If I press this button and this button, something else will happen. So the skills you need to be a good programmer is you obviously need to understand coding and logic. It's not so much about which programming language you learn, I would say, because once you learn one and you start somewhere and you get better at it, it gets easier for you to also pick up others. So don't get too worried about it. If you want to learn how to code, just learn how to code. Use something easy like Scratch, and then you get better, and then you can use something more advanced like Python and C++ and whatever else. But it's more about understanding the logical problems and logical thinking, and also wanting to solve problems. And your tasks might be, you write code for the game. You tell what happens when you press buttons. You might also have to then implement game features and mechanics and make sure that everything comes together on the logical side, and you work with designers and artists to make things work. So let's go back to our voting. We have now, our programmer is getting ready. They have gotten the first character model. What mechanic does the programmer add to a player character first? Should they be able to move forward? Should they be able to wave? Or should they be able to scream? So what's important to us? I'll give you a little voting option. How about moving forward? Pretty important. Waving? Screaming? Okay, right, let's start with the screen, because why not? Right, so now when you hit the X button, the programmer goes in and they connect the logic and they connect the sound and they tell you if the player presses this, then play this sound and play this animation as well, because the mouth has to open, right, and do all these things. Right, now we can scream at the frogs, or scream when the frogs come at us. I'm not sure yet, we'll figure it out. Next up, again, we need more artists. I told you about the concept artist, but the concept artist usually just do 2D drawings and shows us what it's going to look like. But a lot of games you played are three-dimensional, so the characters can actually turn around. So in this case, we might need artists that then actually model the characters in 3D. Or if it's a 2D game, they need to draw the character from all sides, so the character can actually turn around. So here you need to be, again, good at drawing. In some cases, you might also need to have a good grasp of anatomy, because you need to understand like how bodies work, how limbs work and arms work. And you might need to know about specialist software in which you can model. So your job is to create the models and characters of the game, our frogs, our players, the objects that you can interact with, our frog catching backpack maybe. I don't know where we put the frogs, but they have to go somewhere. They also need to paint on the 3D models so that it has a texture and it's not just a gray box. And they have to translate anything that the artist does in 2D into action. And with artists, there's specializations. So that's a really cool thing, because if you, for example, say, I don't like drawing people, I hate drawing people, but I'm really good at drawing pretty landscapes, awesome, there's a job for you. You could be an environment artist. If you've ever walked through a really pretty game world where everything looked really amazing, the tall, shiny buildings, the purple lakes, the big clouds, someone has made that and someone has made designs for that. So environment artists are people that do this kind of work. We had earlier the character artist. We need someone who can make detailed models of the player characters or the figures you interact with. Or maybe sometimes if it's another game where you need a monster, you need someone creative enough to build a monster and figure out how does that move, what does that look like. Animators in VFX, so VFX is like special effects. If you've ever cast a spell in a game and there were little sparks flying about, there's a lot of coding and logic behind, or the fact that your character actually can do this. Someone doesn't just have to model the character, they have to put a skeleton into the character and tell you, if I click this arm, then the arm can move like this. So that's what animators do. They kind of take the 3D models and make them move. It's a really cool and very technical, but also creative job. And if you're even more technical, if you're good at both art and programming, you could become a technical artist. So they work a bit closer like with the programmers or like the programmers, and they solve the technical issues. That's a really rare skill set to have and really high sought after. So if you're good at art and programming stuff, this would be probably a really great job to get into. So for our game, set in Norwich in 2424, where we scream at frogs, what creatures do we want in the game? Does anyone have any ideas? Yeah? Flying frogs, I love that. Okay, that's also changes our story a bit, because now why can the frogs fly in the future? So that's a really great idea. Any other monsters? Characters? Yep, okay. Wonderful. So we are getting some interesting creatures in our game that someone has to make in 3D. And then you have to figure out, how do I add wings to a frog? Where do they go? Do they sit on their heads? Do they sit on their backs? How do they move? So it's a really fun challenge to solve. If you like music, if you like making sounds, if you maybe have a keyboard or a drum set at home, or you play in a band, you might also want to become an audio or sound designer. I kind of cheekily squashed two jobs in one there, because there is both, oh, actually no, I'll take it back. I think one of them comes later. But you have to make the sounds, and you don't just have to make the music for the game, you also have to make, what happens if I pick up a frog? You need the sound of a frog. How are you going to get that? You might have to get some frogs. So I worked in a game studio where we made an update with dinosaurs. The problem is you can't just go up to a dinosaur and record it on the microphone. So suddenly our whole office was filled with dogs, because everyone brought in their dogs and we recorded the dogs, and then the audio people put in their magic and they put some filters and special effects over the dog sounds until the woof woof sounded like a really scary growl. So again, you have to get really creative in this field, and it's really fun. Or if something breaks, You can't really break people's arms to record a sound for the game, but you can break a carrot, and then it makes a crunchy sound, and then you can put that into the game. So it's a really creative, fun thing. If you, sorry, too fast. If you like the idea of putting either sound effects or music into the game, that could be the job for you. You create both sound effects, or some people also just make sure that the audio fits the player experience. And you also have to make sure that all the sounds play at the right time. So let's assume we have a composer for our game. And we want to, when they open the game, there's usually a sort of music. What do we want them to feel? Do we want them to feel maybe amused? Maybe is the game a bit humorous and funny? Do we want them to feel sad? Because maybe actually a game is really tragic. Or maybe do we want them to feel curious through the music? So let's do a vote. Do we want them to feel amused? Is our game silly? Okay. Do we want them to feel sad? No. Okay, no sadness. Curious? Okay, maybe both, you know. I felt that was pretty even. So maybe it's both amusing and curious. So now can you imagine what a curious and amusing song would sound like? What instruments would you use? If you have some ideas, maybe you are a future audio designer. And I'm going really fast, so again, I can probably slow down. Voice actors. If characters talk to each other in the game and you just have to read the text, that can be pretty boring. So often, when we click on a character, they will also speak to us. So we need a person who is an actual actor to record all the lines that this character says, including the tragic lines and the funny lines. So if you are into acting, if you maybe are in a drama class, or you just really like to put on different accents because you're really good at this, maybe you can pretend to be Scottish or Welsh or Australian or have a little bit of a German accent. Voice acting might be a really fun thing for you because you have to be able to express yourself, you have to be able to be dramatic and funny or sad. So in that case, you would just read the lines that go into the game and really perform them. So if acting is your job, acting is also part of the video games industry, even though you don't see their faces. So that would be a really cool job that some people could do. And if you played any games where there's really intense scenes in it, think about that someone had to sit somewhere and actually record all those lines. Okay, so we have now produced our game. We have now put all the things together. We made our screaming happen and hopefully also some other functions in the game. We added our little soundtrack and everything. Now we are going into the next phase, testing and pre-launch, where we make sure that the game actually works for people. Is it fun? Does it work? How is it gonna get out into the world? So the first thing we need here, someone mentioned it earlier, is a QA specialist. QA is just short for quality assurance, but if that is a word that's hard to remember, you can just think of them as game testers. What they do, what you need to be a game tester is you have to have attention to detail. You might have to notice like, oh, something here doesn't feel quite right. You have to have a lot of patience. It's not something people think about, but imagine, because it sounds great, like, right? You get to play a game your whole day long, but what if you have to play the same level 30 times? I guarantee you, because I've done this before, it gets really boring, so you also have to bring some patience to that job. But it can be very fun as well. And you need critical thinking. You need to be able to get good feedback and say, I expected this to happen. This should have happened instead, and communicate that to people. So what you do is you test the game. You might play levels. You might try new features that the programmers added. If you find something that's broken, you have to document it. So you have to be really good at writing down, this is broken. This is what I did to break it, and that's why. And you also, once the programmer says, oh, I fixed it, you also have to test it again and make sure, does it actually work? Or maybe did they not see something? And it's a really fun and surprisingly creative job because you have to anticipate all the things that people could do with the game. Because you can tell players, press these 3 buttons and no other buttons. But I guarantee you they will press all the other buttons just to see what happens. So you have to test all these cases and give improvement feedback. But it's a really cool and interesting job. That is also like definitely a job in its own. I think sometimes people think, oh, this is just like my first job and then I go into something else, but good QA testers are worth so much and they're like really fantastic people, so worth keeping in mind. Then we'll talk about UX designers. UX stands for user experience. And that's another role that's not talked about very often, but that I find really, really interesting. If you're really good at empathy, if you're really good at understanding how other people tick, and again, if you like to solve problems, that might be a cool job for you, because what you do there is, instead of just testing the game yourself, like the QA testers, you might get a bunch of people in and let them test the game, and then you report like, did they get the game? Did they find it fun? Did they find it engaging? Why not? So there is a research aspect to it, and it's really interesting. You research their behaviors and their preferences. For example, if we also said we want to make our game really interesting to people over 60, well, how are you going to find that out? You need to sit down with people over 60 and figure out what makes them play games. I mean, by that point, maybe 60-year-olds are the main group of people that play video games. So yeah, you're there to create a smooth player experience to make sure it's fun. So that's another very niche job, but definitely something to think about if you're neither an artist nor maybe a programmer. That's really cool. I really like this job because I like people, I like psychology. So this is a cool thing I did not know about until much later. I couldn't not talk about this because I worked in this field, translation and testing. So here your skills are, you need to speak a second language and you need to speak it well. Usually you will translate games from another language that is your second language into your native language. So if you are a native English speaker, you will probably, for example, learn Japanese, and then you could work for Nintendo and translate games from Japanese into English. I worked and I translated games from English into German, and I didn't study linguistics, but I read a lot of fantasy books as a kid, and apparently that helped too. So there you go. If you read a lot, just say you want to be a localization tester later, and no one can say anything about it. Take that, teachers. So your job is to translate a game into a different language. You also have to make sure that when you test the game that someone else translated, does it still make sense? Because translating games is tricky, because sometimes you just have a single word like exit. Is it like the exit, as in the door, or to exit, or something else? And if you just have one word, you need to become a real detective to figure out how I translate it, because in German, this door and me going out of the door have two different words. So tricky. And you also, because you usually, the game is made first and then it's translated, need to work with others to make sure it can go out into other markets. And game translation is really important and will continue to be so, because if you make the best game in the world and it's just in English, there's hundreds of thousands and millions of people that don't speak English. So how are you going to bring the game to them? You translate it. Marketing. We made this amazing game, but no one knows about it. So who's going to tell them about it? The marketing team does. As a marketing person, you need to be creative, but you also need analytical thinking. You need to be able to read some reports and figure out who will the players be, who is best, who's going to be really interested in this. Do we maybe have some people who are frog enthusiasts? How do you reach a frog enthusiast? Where are they? Are they on TikTok? Are they on Instagram? Are they on weird frog forums? I don't know. The marketing team can help you figure it out and figure out how to talk to them. And again, you need to be good at communicating, at making things sound exciting and fun. So in the marketing team, you come up with strategies. You might create promotional materials. You might just print a flyer and say, play your frog game. Or maybe you go into a big city and release a bunch of mechanical frogs that hop around and drop codes to your game. I don't know. Maybe you're a better marketer than me, probably. And that's another really interesting job that is really common and much needed in the games industry. So you don't have to actually work on the game to be part of the game making process. Okay, well, we've done it. We've made a game, we've tested it, it looks good, it's marketed. We launch it. Should we launch it? Okay, thank you. Are we done? No, we're not done, because just because the game is live does not mean as game makers we're done, because now we have lots of people coming in. The community manager, maybe now we found lots of people that play our game and they start posting about it online, but we want to know what they say about it, right? So maybe we want to create a Discord where they can talk about the game and get excited about our next frog feature, or maybe we want to talk to people on other social media platforms. So if you're someone who's really good at setting up Discords, making sure people stay nice in there and talk to each other, and there's rules in place and tools in place, Maybe community management is a cool job for you. And what you do is you talk to the players online and make sure they have a good experience, they're safe. Maybe if it's a multiplayer game, they want to find people to play with. So you also need to create a nice group of people that actually are friendly to each other. Great thing is, if people talk to each other about the game, they might also say things about the game like, man, I wish the frogs could fly. So in that case, we also want to give that feedback on and share it with the team internally. And you might want to organize events. Maybe you do a special event in the game where suddenly frogs all get replaced by doves, and you're like, what's going on? So that could be a fun job for you. And there's lots more jobs that come after that have to do with the games industry and come afterwards. I summarized them. They're all probably really deep, in-depth jobs in themselves. I'm not super in touch with that because I work more on making games rather than this, but there's pro gamers. Maybe if your game has some esports elements, maybe there will be a league and people will be competing to be the best frog catchers. There's esports shoutcasters, there's content creators. Sometimes there's people who just have channels about games. Maybe if our game is a cozy game, I want to talk to a content creator who makes cozy game videos and recommends to their group, like, hey, there's the latest cozy game, Norwich 2022 24 Frog Invasion. Title is work in progress, we'll find something better. But yeah, that's another job you could potentially do. Maybe you just focus on one specific game and make videos about it and make it exciting. And there's games journalists, there's people who work in games magazines and report about the newest stuff that's happening both within games or the games industry. And there's more. Behind the scenes, there's lots more jobs because, like I told you, a lot of these games are made in big organizations. When I worked at Jagex, it was anything between 350 and 450 people, and not all of them were the people making the games. We had people in finance, we had an IT team. So even though you don't work on the game directly, what you need to make a game is you need a lot of high quality computers that are in a really, really safe and secure network that is protected from the outside because you don't want the game to leak. So if you want to work in IT, you could work in IT in games. We need analytics people, we need people in HR, which stands for human resources. So basically they're looking after the people within the organization and make sure they're happy and they can learn. And there's someone tells them how many holidays they can take. There's recruitment. We talked about so many cool jobs, but someone has to also find people who can do these jobs and bring them into the company. There's facilities. If you have a building, someone has to look after the building and make sure everything is working fine. There's law, that you need to be really specialized IT knowledge about like what are the computer laws, can be released as game in another language because maybe frogs are illegal in a country. What do we do there? What's the rules? How old do you have to be to play the game, and who can advise on this? There might be a video team that creates video content, and there might be game scouts because some games businesses don't make their own games. They just help other people publish their own games. So one job that's really interesting, and I should probably put it on its own slide, is a game scout. If you work for a publisher, if you're really good at finding interesting new games that no one has heard about, that might also be a job in itself, where you just try out different games from smaller studios and then make recommendations to the big publisher and says, I think this game is going to be really big and it works really well for us. So again, really niche job, but very interesting and something you could do. And much more. So I'll tell you how you can research more, because I gave you like a really small overview of a lot of jobs, and hopefully there was some in there where you were like, wow, I never thought I could do this. So how do you find out more? One resource, feel free to take pictures of these slides. It's fine, I'll keep my face out of the way. One of these is Into Games. If you go to intogames.org or just Google Into Games, they have a section on their website where all those roles are broken into much bigger, smaller detail, and also should tell you if you're like still in school, what GCSEs could you pick to get into this, and later what could you study to get into this. So it breaks down the paths into a lot of these roles more. There is a Games Careers resource library, which they're also running, which is not directly on the website, but you can find it. And this is something I look after. So whenever someone posts a really good article about how to get into games, I add it in there. And there's also a Discord server if you're old enough to be on Discord, and a nice community of other people who are trying to work in the games industry. There is an entry-level skills report, which is on entrylevel.games. That came out last year, and what they did is they looked at the nine most common jobs in games, and really break down what skills do you need to get in this, what are the behaviors you need to lead, what does a good CV look like, what does a good portfolio look like, so you can also really figure out what experience you need to gather. And there's many more. There's Screen Skills, has a nice job profiles website. There's Grads and Games, and there's a Games Career Week on from the 24th to 30th of June. I thought I'd put that in there because that's soon. They usually have things online as well. So again, if you want to have more specialized talks for games, that might be something to check out. And lastly, making games is usually the best way to get into games. And if you want to start making games, you might need a team, you might want to learn from people. So here's some online communities or communities you can connect with. I have been in all of these and I found them welcoming and safe, but obviously I also make sure it's age appropriate. If you're a bit younger, talk to your parents about it before joining it, please. But locally, we have the Norfolk Game Developers. That's a really nice group of professionals. We have anything age-wise from students to people my age and older that make their own games. So there's show and tell events where everyone can just show the game they're working on, and it doesn't matter how good you are, whether you just made your first game and it's just a really simple point and click adventure, or whether you made a really complicated game with several people. Anyone can show off their game every 2 months in a real event and get some feedback. And also there's a Discord community. There's Game Anglia, who are also really lovely and do lots of meetings in person. They do the wider east of England and also the Cambridgeshire region. They also have Discord and sometimes also mentorship schemes. There's Code Coven, which is specifically for people from underrepresented genders. So they sometimes have boot camps and training programs. There's OMG, Out Making Games, which is specifically for people who work in games that are LGBTQ+. There's Women in Games, which are for women in games. Very self-explanatory. And there's Safe in Our World, who are a charity with a Discord which specializes in mental health. So if you are working in games, but you might struggle with mental health, which is an important thing, you can go there and find some resources. And that's me talking, so we have 20 minutes to ask any questions. Thank you so much for listening to all of this. And if you have a mobile phone, you want to give some feedback in some interactive bits, you can do it here by scanning the QR code, but you have 20 minutes to do this, so no rush. Okay. Thank you. And maybe I'll sit down so I don't look like a scary person who's just standing there staring at all of you. Anyone, any questions? Yeah.
I worked in the game industry.
Mm-hmm.
2.5 years of experience as a QA tester.
Mm-hmm.
I was recently made redundant in January.
Yeah.
But I graduated university 5 years ago as a game designer with a master's in game development.
Mm-hmm.
I'm personally working on my own game, and I've always wanted to go focus on game design. As you said earlier, I thought I found QA as an entry job, but then I sort of fell in love with it and I stuck with it for a bit.
Mm.
But now I thought, now that I've been made redundant, might be nice, perfect time to try to move into game design, which was my original goal. So my question is it worth focusing and honing on making my own game and publishing my own game and using the skills and knowledge I got of the industry for my QA role to apply for game design jobs?
Mm.
Or is it better to hone and focus on the QA testing and just work up with that?
I'm probably not going to give you the straightforward answer you're going to wish for, but I think the first thing is to figure out for yourself, like, how urgently do you need a job and how much time do you have? If you don't have much time or energy or resources, I'd always recommend try everything you can to just get yourself stable. Also consider taking jobs outside of the games industry just to get on your feet. If you want to switch into, like, you know, if in Q&A, if your QA experience, it might also be transferable to another area outside of games with how everything is going in games at the moment. That's valid too. So first of all, look after your own safety and make sure you're comfortable. And when it comes to how to get into a specific field, if you worked in QA before, you might have contacts still to old game design colleagues. They probably give you much better advice you have. So I'd look at my portfolio, I'd compare it to some people who work currently in games in the games portfolio and just have a look. How up to date is mine? Does it look really outdated? If so, what are quick wins I can do to get it up to date? How can I also show what I learned in QA? Because QA experience is so valuable for game design, right? So if you just find the right way to talk about your experience and put that into the right light, you hopefully don't have to go and make a whole game. And when it comes to making games, something I forgot to mention, but if you want to get into making games, there's something called game jams. Well, you probably got lots of experience, but game jams, as you might have seen some upstairs, are just a short time of period where you work with the team and you make a game really fast. Usually over weekends, sometimes over weeks, sometimes over a month. So game jams are a good way to just add lots of things and get things done really fast. Fill up your portfolio. So yeah, they're fun ways to just get experience fast and fill it up. But yeah, I'd say what I found most helpful, especially when changing careers, is tapping into the network, building my network, talking with people in the jobs I want to do, and just ask them to give me feedback. Like, have a frank look at my portfolio. What's missing? What do I have to do? Because, and you will get 5 million opinions for 5 million people ask. So that was a very convoluted answer.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I'm an actor. I went to one of the top drama schools in the UK, and I've got an agent, and haven't exactly been that successful. I've had a few decent acting jobs, mm-hmm. Been very sparse, but something I've always wanted to do is voice acting for video games. I've had a couple of auditions for voice work, but I have no idea how to really get into that particular field. That's something that's always really interested me. But most of the auditions I get are for kind of voice acting things, so I've always been curious as to what the way in with that would be.
Mm. So again, probably first of all, I've never worked in voice acting, so my advice is also just from what I see from the outside. One thing is really good to have is a reel. I don't know if as an actor you have a reel, but as oh, perfect. Well, there you go. So you've done the first step. If you want to be a voice actor, you would usually record a video of your voice doing different characters that just shows you, this is how I pretend to be an old man. This is how I pretend to be, I don't know, an 80-year-old woman. This is how I pretend to be a dwarf. And having that reel up on your website is really good. Connecting, again, the more specialized you're trying to go, I'd always say community is a really good thing, talking to people who've already made it. I know there is some really good communities for voice actors, but I don't know them off the top of my head. So what I can do maybe afterwards, if you want to hang around and give me details, I can see if I can remember someone that's in that group and see if they have any recommendations for you. So communities are great because sometimes people, and another website to check out is Work with Indies, which I forgot to mention. Don't know if you know about them. Okay, so Work with Indies is another website and community where smaller studios that make indie games look for people to help them with work. So that's sometimes also something that might be more accessible to find paid work that is on a smaller scale, and then you can fill up your voice reel on actual games. And again, game jams. Ask someone if they're making a really narrative game and they need someone to narrate it, and then you have something like quite game specific on there. Game jams can be quite open to anyone. So no matter how niche your thing is, if you go to a game jam and say, does someone need a voice actor? There will probably be one team who's like, yes, we have a narrative game and all of us are terrified of speaking. So yeah, that's some advice, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Getting the crystal ball out and looking maybe 5-6 years into the future, what sort of new skills do you think are going to become really valuable in the games industry?
Okay. My tarot and witching days are over, so I don't know how accurate this is going to be. I think one thing I already mentioned earlier, intersectional skills between, for example, anything that can work between areas, like technical artists, for example, rather than just a programmer, quite specialized jobs can be really good. So if you say, I know how to both talk to artists and to tech people, and I can combine those skills, that's really good. At least that's very sought after now. Don't know if that's suddenly going to be saturated in 5 to 6 years. Another thing, just evolving technology. So I know that AI is a bit of a topic at the moment, and I think some companies are still trying to figure out if and how they're going to embed it, because I think there was a bit of a hype and now there's a bit of a drop. But in the long term, that will probably stabilize and that will probably be a mixed model. So if you have interest in that sort of technology, how can you get involved in it? And I think generally just finding your passion. I think rather than also just looking at the market, I'd look at what skills am I good at, what do I enjoy doing, what is fun to me, because if you want to do a job in the long term, it's also important to just find the fun in it and then figure out, okay, maybe I'm really good at being creative and this, and what am I not good at, and then what jobs work on this. So I'd say work on your skills, work on the things you like doing, figure out what's fun for you, and then figure out when games could that set. Yeah. That'd be my very personal advice. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, Susie. I'd like to know a little bit more about the apprenticeships that you, that I, when I did your introduction, that you were getting involved in offering. Do you know what's happening there and the variety of the roles that are available?
Okay.
In the industry?
Yes. So I'm gonna be quite honest. It's very middling, because right now a lot of people are coming out of universities, so most studios can just pick people from universities that already have a lot more experience. And the problem with apprenticeships is an apprenticeship needs to be designed, so an apprenticeship needs to be very defined. Someone has to say, these are all the knowledge, skills and behaviors, this is how the standard looks like. They take a long time to develop, and the games industry is way behind in developing them. Film and TV have caught up, most other industries have caught up because they've been around for longer, and the games industry is very behind. So right now there is a level 7 games programmer apprenticeship that you can do. So you would do a level 7 is equivalent to a master's degree, so you'd also want to be quite proficient at programming and technology. And then you could try to find a studio that takes apprentices in this field. So you would then learn how to code specifically for games. So that is one of the ones, and that's sadly the only big one. There's also a level 4 community, I think it's something not community management, but I think it's community and customer apprenticeship that some studios have tapped into. But I will be very honest, there's not that much of a market yet, just because the standards aren't there and the industry is still catching up on creating those standards. And then you need to get studios and explain to them why they should bring in an apprentice rather than just hiring someone they can take. So very honestly, it was very hard in this job because we were still working on figuring out where could apprentices be doing. We did suggest what would be really cool is to have a QA apprenticeship, because QA is actually one of those fields you can neither properly study at the moment, nor is there any clear unified degrees. So QA might be an interesting one because it is quite a teachable thing and it's very practical. So I'd hope that would happen. And I know that production and some other fields are looking how they can make existing apprenticeship standards work for the games industry, but it's still in transition. So this is my very realistic and slightly pessimistic take, but I hope, some people in the industry are doing really amazing work to make it better. So hopefully it will improve. Okay. Yeah.
I have another question. I feel like this one's a bit silly to ask. But I'm 28 now. And I'm concerned about my age and about applying to these jobs as I get older and with little experience. Because I don't know if I look at my 2.5 years and I don't feel there's a lot of experience. I'm worried about being university students coming out who do deserve the jobs, but being favoured over someone who is gradually getting older with little experience.
Well, first of all, you don't have to include your age in your CV, and no one has to know. So
you get asked a lot.
Right.
Applications, they do tend to ask quite a bit. That was sort of why I was a bit curious about that as well.
I mean, from the personal experience of the studios I've been in, I've seen people enter and exit the industry at all sorts of ages. You get some people who just are whizzes and they skip university altogether. They just made some cool games, they applied, they got lucky, they got in, they never even went close to a degree, and they just learned stuff and got in. So qualifications are also not everything. It's mostly about being able to build skills and show that you can. It's actually probably going to be worth more if you can show, I made 1 or 2 whole games, you can play them right now, and this is what I learned. If you can articulate that, it's probably going to be as valid, if not more valid, than some degrees. So again, degrees are one thing, and the other thing is people leave the industry, people come back to the industry, people transition a lot in the industry. I've changed my jobs so drastically. I started out in translation, then I did diversity and inclusion, then I was the head of careers, and now I'm doing ADHD coaching and training design. So, no one can stop me. As long as people pay me, I don't mind. So I think it's about just figuring out what you want to do and going for it. And if they're not hiring you because you're too old, like, their loss. I think that's, yeah. But I don't know of anyone that I've ever heard of talking about like, oh, that person might be a bit too old or too young. The only feedback I've ever seen was when we had like an interview and everyone in the games industry usually dresses quite casual, and someone came in a suit and tie, and I was like, what are they doing here? I don't know if they would feel comfortable here. So I think it's more important that you know, get a sense that what's the industry like and how do you fit in. And another thing, again, I forget to mention earlier, is also mentorship can be really valuable. So in the UK, there is a mentorship program called Limit Break. It's only for people from marginalized backgrounds, and also it only opens once a year, and it actually just closed this round. So it's not for this year, but in the future, there is also mentorship programs where if you want to find someone who already works in the industry in your dream job, you can also talk to them and say, like, how do I get where you are? And they might give you feedback over time and mentor you and help you specifically build your network, build your skills. That can be really, really valuable, just finding a person. You don't have to wait for a scheme. Sometimes you might also just find someone and meet someone at an event that is really nice and talks to you and can maybe help you get in there. So finding a mentor can be really helpful. But again, I know it's not easy. So, yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
What advice do you have in regards to getting noticed by bigger video game companies? Because obviously there's a lot of like indie devs out there, there's lots of small studios, but what if you want to aim for the bigger studios?
Apply relentlessly and ruthlessly to any jobs that you think are good. Work on your CV. Make sure that your CV is also readable for all these, because most CVs that go through big companies, they will usually have some sort of system that reads them and processes them, and it can be a right pain. So make sure that your CV is readable. I think there's some websites you can use to just test, like, how does a computer read my CV. Don't worry, usually there will still be a person looking at it. You won't get auto-rejected, but it's quite important that in the process where lots of names were going to come in, your information is clear and available. Something good to keep in mind is just, yeah, have a really good CV, have a really good portfolio. If you know someone working in that studio, ask them a little bit about, maybe, do you know that team? Do you know who's interviewing there? Figure out how they work, figure out, yeah, who you're going to talk to, because the more you can show them you care about them and the problems they have and how you can solve them rather than just about their title, the better it's going to be. Because one thing that's really important for applications is that you can show you understand their problems and you want to solve them, and not just you want to work on this game because it's your favorite game. Because they also need to be able to see you as a professional and not just as a player of the game. I think that's a mistake that people sometimes made. We get people who are really excited about, I really want, this is like my favorite game. That can sometimes be actually a bit like, should you work on this? Because can you actually be a professional working on this game rather than just a player? So finding that right professionalism. But other than that, just apply, because working for a big studio is just a numbers game. They get a lot of applications. And usually a recruiter, especially for a big organization like this, will look at your CV for 7 to 10 seconds is the statistic I read at some point. So they have to, in 7 to 8 seconds, they have to be able to see the 4 or 5 things they look for really fast on your CV, because once they see that, they might put you on the pile to look at it a bit longer. But that's basically a thing to keep in mind. How fast can I make that impression? And is all the important stuff really, really visible? Yeah, hope that helps. How are we with time? Okay, so we're basically almost at the end. One more question, if anyone has anything? No? Cool. Well, if you want to scan the QR code, you can fill that in later. It will just ask you several things. It might also be useful for you to just, oh yeah, someone filled it in actually. Oh, let me show you this, because this is actually fun. So we can see live how people find to talk. They learn something new, they found something game. You can also rate which disciplines you like to work on, which might be good for you to think about this again. And also, one thing I'd recommend to you is thinking about, if you want to work in games, what is one thing you're going to do? Are you going to go away and look up that job a bit more that you just liked? Are you going to update your CV? Are you going to try to make a game? So have a think about that, because it's always good to listen to me, but the best thing is to take action and just do one thing that brings you closer to the thing you want to do, because that's where the good stuff happens. Okay, thank you so much.